My name is Sergeant Claire Monroe. I'm 32 years old, and I serve in the United States Army. I've served my country through 2 deployments in Afghanistan, and I thought I understood what an enemy was. I was wrong. The most dangerous enemy was waiting for me back home, in Ohio. When I walked into my family's house in my dress uniform, holding my promotion orders and a $20 million bonus check, my brother, Rick, just smirked. 20 million for some PowerPoint slides? Don't make me laugh. My father roared from his armchair. You think those stripes on your sleeve make you better than anyone in this house? My mother said nothing, her eyes glued to a magazine. And then Rick came at me, not with a shove, but with a full-blown punch to my jaw. I heard the crack of bone before my head slammed against the hardwood floor. The stench of cheap beer washed over me as he leaned down and snarled. This is the real chain of command, you bitch. Lying there, in a pool of my own blood, I had only one thought. They had no idea I always had a contingency plan for this day. If you've ever had to fight for respect in your own home, tell me where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe. Because this is the story of how a soldier used the rules of engagement to take back her life. The drive home was a ritual of quiet hope. The familiar ribbon of I-71 unwound before me, taking me away from the rigid, predictable world of Fort Belvoir and deeper into the rolling green hills of southern Ohio. I passed the same old landmarks that dotted the highway to Cincinnati. The giant statue of Jesus, the Kings Island Water Tower. Each one felt like a milestone, ticking off the distance between the soldier I was and the daughter I hoped to be. The streets in my suburban neighborhood were lined with oak trees, their leaves just beginning to turn the color of rust. Every house was a variation of the same theme. 2 stories, a wide lawn. A basketball hoop standing sentinel in the driveway. I'd called ahead, told them I was on my way. I pictured a warm hug, maybe a welcome home. The simple things you tell yourself you'll get, even when history suggests otherwise. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I turned off the engine and the silence pressed in, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower. I took a deep breath, straightened the jacket of my Army service uniform, and walked to the front door. The air inside was thick with an oppressive stillness. In the living room, my father, Arthur, was sunk into his worn, lazy boy recliner, his eyes locked on the Cincinnati Bengals getting crushed on the big screen TV. The familiar orange and black flickered across his face. He didn't turn his head. He just grunted, a single dismissive nod that acknowledged my existence but offered nothing more. From the kitchen, the scent of my mother's apple pie wafted through the house, a smell that should have meant warmth and welcome, but instead felt like a carefully constructed lie. Helen stood by the counter, wiping it down with a cloth. You're here, she said, her voice flat. Wash up for dinner. No hug, no questions about the drive, not even a glance at the uniform I wore with so much pride. And then there was Rick. My older brother was slouched at the kitchen table, nursing a bottle of Bud Light, the label already peeling from the condensation. His eyes, heavy-lidded and resentful, scanned me from head to toe. A slow, contemptuous smirk spread across his face as he took in the sergeant stripes on my sleeves, the ribbons on my chest. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any insult. It was a complete and total erasure. In their eyes, my achievements, my service, my entire world, it was all invisible. I decided to try, to break through the wall of indifference they had so expertly built. I walked to the dining table and placed my leather briefcase on its polished surface. The click of the latches seemed deafening in the quiet room. My voice came out a little shaky, a mixture of road fatigue and a desperate, fluttering hope. I have some good news, I began, pulling out a crisp manila envelope. My software project, it was approved by the Pentagon. They're giving me a bonus and a promotion. I held out the official letter, the embossed seal of the Department of the Army facing up. I aimed it toward my father, praying for a flicker of pride, a single moment of validation. Arthur's eyes darted from the screen to the paper for a fraction of a second, then back to the game. Good, he grumbled. More money for you to contribute to this house. The words stung, reducing my career to a line item on a budget. But it was Rick who lit the fuse. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "How much they give you, sis? A couple $100,000?" I kept my voice steady, my military discipline kicking in. $20 million, Rick. It was a defense contract bonus, split with my team. The air went still. Rick's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, venomous disbelief. His laugh, when it came again, was ugly and sharp. 20 million? For some PowerPoint slides? He leaned forward, the bottle of Bud Light clutched in his hand. In the real world, people have to sweat and bleed for their money, little sister. That was it. That was the line. The disciplined soldier took over. My voice was cold, precise. My sweat and blood were spilled in the deserts of Afghanistan while you were sitting here drinking beer and watching TV, Rick. It was a mistake. A tactical error in a war I didn't know I was fighting. My father launched himself out of his lazy-boy, his face turning a deep, mottled red. "You shut your mouth," he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Who the hell do you think you are, talking down to your brother in my house?" That was all the encouragement Rick needed. Fueled by his own failures and my father's blessing, he shoved himself away from the table and lunged at me. His fist was a blur. My training screamed at me, block, parry, counter. I could have dropped a man twice his size before he ever laid a hand on me. But for a single, fatal millisecond, I hesitated. This is my brother. That hesitation cost me everything. His knuckles connected with my jaw with a sickening, wet crunch. The force of the blow sent me staggering backward, my head slamming into the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed in my skull. The world exploded into a mess of flashing lights and searing pain. I lay there, dazed, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. Through the watery blur of unshed tears, I could see them. My mother, Helen, stood perfectly still in the doorway to the kitchen, a dish towel clutched in her hands, her face a blank mask. She didn't move an inch. My father stood over me, a look of grim satisfaction on his face as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "See? You can be a general out there, but in here, you're still my daughter. You need to know your place." Then Rick knelt beside me, his face close to mine. The foul, sour stench of cheap beer from his breath washed over me. He looked down at me, broken and bleeding on the floor of the home I grew up in, and he snarled the words that would change everything. "This is the real chain of command, you bitch." In that moment, looking up at the three of them, I no longer saw my family. I saw three enemies standing victorious over a fallen opponent. But they had forgotten one crucial thing about me. A soldier never ever accepts defeat. The war had just been declared. And as I stared at the familiar patterns of the ceiling, a thought cut through the pain, cold and clear. It didn't start tonight. Where did it all go so wrong? The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital room were the first things I registered. I opened my eyes to a stark white ceiling, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from my jaw where Rick's fist had connected. A clear IV line was taped to my arm. The question I'd asked myself on the floor of my parents' home echoed in my mind. Where did it all go so wrong? The answer wasn't in that single violent moment. It was mapped out in a landscape of smaller, older scars. My mind drifted, pulling me back to a brightly lit stage 16 years ago. The Columbus Convention Center buzzed with energy. I was at the Ohio State Science Fair, a heavy gold medal hanging around my neck. First place. My prototype for a self-contained GPS navigation system, built from salvaged parts, had won. My heart pounded with a fierce pride. I couldn't wait to show my father. But when I walked through the door, the living room was already a shrine to my brother. Rick, who had just made the high school football team as a third-string linebacker, was being celebrated like a hero. My father, Arthur, had his arms slung around Rick's shoulders, his voice booming. "Now this is a true champion. That's Monroe blood for you." He glanced at me, saw the medal, and gave a curt nod before turning back to Rick. "We're a family of winners, boy." The gold medal in my hand suddenly felt cold and heavy, like a stone. That night, I quietly slipped it into an old shoebox under my bed. It's still there, a monument to achievements that were never seen. A sharp pain from my jaw pulled me back to the antiseptic present. The dull ache was a physical anchor to years of emotional blows. I remembered the summer I was 17. I'd saved every dollar from 2 years of double shifts at a diner for one thing: freedom. That freedom came in the form of a beat-up, 10-year-old Ford Escort. It was ugly, but it was mine. It was my escape. One Friday night, Rick took the keys without asking. He and his friends went joyriding and blew the engine. My parents didn't ground him. They didn't even make him apologize. Instead, they sat me down at the kitchen table. My father explained that Rick had made a mistake and the family had to fix it. My punishment for Rick's crime was selling my car for scrap. To cover some of the damages, my father said. My mother chimed in, her voice soft and placating. Besides, what does a girl need a car for anyway? I watched from my window as a tow truck hauled away the wreck of my first taste of independence. The steady beep of the monitor seemed to count off the years. Enlisting at 18 was my only escape, a nod to my grandfather's legacy and a desperate bid to leave that house. The Army offered something my family never had: clear rules, a merit-based system, and a significant enlistment bonus. Of course, my parents called a family meeting. My father spread papers on the table, talking about shared sacrifice and a Monroe Family Investment Fund he would manage. "This will grow for your future, Claire," he'd promised. Months later, while I was crawling through mud at Fort Jackson, I learned the truth from a cousin. Rick had used the entire bonus to open a flashy sports bar in downtown Cincinnati. It went bankrupt in 6 months. When I called home, betrayed and furious, my mother just cried. "You have to help your brother, Claire. That's what family does. We support each other." But one memory was a lighthouse in the storm. My grandfather, Captain James Monroe. He sat on his porch swing, his old dress uniform in a glass case in his living room. He was the one who taught me to read a map, to find my bearings by the stars. He saw the engineer's mind behind my eyes. Shortly before he passed away, he held my hand, his grip still firm. "This one," he'd said, looking right at me. "You have the mind of a strategist and the heart of a lion, kiddo. Don't you ever let the small people drag you down." He'd pressed his old military-issue compass into my palm. "Never let anyone else tell you which way is north. You find your own." His words became my true north, my internal compass. The memory of his voice was a comfort, but it was quickly chased away by a more recent, colder one. Last Christmas, my final leave before this deployment. I'd spent a good chunk of my salary on their gifts, a foolish attempt to buy their affection. A high-end fishing watch for my father, a pearl necklace for my mother, a brand new flat-screen TV for Rick. They opened them with polite, perfunctory thanks before handing me mine: a generic, on-sale pajama set and a card signed simply, "From the family." Later that night, I overheard my father in the kitchen. "All this money she throws around," he'd scoffed to my mother. "What's she trying to prove? She owes us anyway." The truth hit me then. In their eyes, I wasn't a daughter. I was an investment finally paying dividends, a resource to be managed. The monitor's beep pulled me back to the present. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a campaign of emotional and financial warfare waged against me my entire life. The punch to the jaw wasn't the start of the war. It was just the first time the battle had turned physical. Grandpa was right. I had to get back up. But in this place, this hospital room, the battlefield had changed. It was no longer about fists and fury. It was a psychological war. And I was about to deploy every tactic I'd ever learned. When I woke up, the psychological war I'd anticipated had already begun. I wasn't in a civilian hospital in Ohio. My status as active duty military and the severity of my injuries, a broken jaw, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion, had gotten me medevaced to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland. The cold, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant. My first visitor was my father. He stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed over his chest, his expression hard as granite. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask what happened. He simply stared at me for a long moment, his eyes cold and unforgiving, and then he delivered his verdict. "See the consequences of your arrogance," he hissed, his voice a low growl. "Maybe now you'll finally learn to respect the order of this family." The words were a poison injected directly into my IV drip. They confirmed my darkest fear. In his eyes, I wasn't the victim of a brutal assault. I was an insubordinate soldier who had been rightfully disciplined. The battle lines were drawn. This hospital room was not a sanctuary. It was enemy territory. For the next 3 days, my room became their stage. They drove all the way from Ohio and set up a relentless psychological siege. They weren't there to care for me. They were there to control the narrative, to break me down while I was at my most vulnerable. They'd arrive every morning, bringing with them the greasy smell of Burger King breakfast sandwiches, and they'd sit around my bed like vultures waiting for a meal. They'd talk loudly, laugh, and complain about the hospital parking, treating my recovery room like their personal lounge. Rick was the chief propagandist. He would cheerfully recount the story of my accident to any nurse who would listen. "Yeah, she just tripped, clumsy as always," he'd say with a chuckle. "Guess she's not as graceful as she looks in that uniform." He made it sound like a slapstick comedy routine, not a violent felony. My mother, Helen, played her part with masterful subtlety. She would sigh dramatically, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "We've tried our best with her, you know," she'd whisper to the medical staff, her voice dripping with faux sorrow. "But that army environment, it's made her so aggressive." I overheard her talking to a young nurse in the hallway, suggesting I was suffering from PTSD, that my instability was the real cause of my injuries. She was poisoning the well, systematically dismantling my credibility one lie at a time. I later learned she had even gone to her church back home, tearfully asking the congregation to pray for her troubled, wayward daughter who was hurting herself. She was playing the martyr in public while acting as my tormentor in private. Every word was a carefully calibrated weapon designed to isolate me, to make me doubt my own sanity. This was an interrogation. I was a prisoner of war. And a flicker of memory from my SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, ignited in my mind. The instructors had put us through brutal mock interrogations, teaching us how to withstand psychological torture. "Never let them see your fear," the instructor's voice echoed in my head. "Control what you can control. Your breathing, your thoughts, your reactions. Become a black hole. Give them nothing." I was trapped in a broken body. My ribs screamed with every breath, and one side of my face was a swollen, purple mask. I couldn't fight back physically, but I could resist. I summoned every ounce of military discipline I had. I stopped speaking. I stopped reacting. When they talked to me, I stared at the wall. When Rick taunted me, I focused on the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, turning it into a meditative drumbeat. I regulated my breathing, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. I treated them not as family, but as my captors. I was no longer Claire Monroe, their daughter. I was Sergeant Monroe, a U.S. soldier holding her ground behind enemy lines. My silence infuriated them. It was a language they couldn't understand, a fortress they couldn't breach. "Still playing the silent treatment, huh?" Rick sneered, leaning over my bed. "You think you're so much better than us?" I didn't even turn my head. I focused on the pulse of the machine, the rise and fall of my own chest. I was in survival mode, conserving every scrap of energy for the real fight to come. My silence was not weakness. It was my most defiant act of war. On the 3rd day of the siege, they escalated their attack. Rick was pacing at the foot of my bed, a smug look on his face. "You know, I heard they give you a medical discharge for this kind of thing," he said loudly, making sure I could hear every word. "All that work, just to get kicked out for being mentally unstable. What a waste." He was still talking when the door to my hospital room swung open with a firm, authoritative push. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He had the unmistakable posture of a career military officer, ramrod straight, radiating an aura of calm, unshakable command. It was Colonel Jonathan Hale, United States Marine Corps, retired. The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. The smug expression on my father's face dissolved, his skin turning a pasty white. My mother gasped, her jaw dropping as the Bible she was clutching slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Rick, who had been puffing out his chest seconds before, physically shrank back a step, his bravado evaporating like mist. I looked at their shocked, fearful faces, and for the first time in days, a small, barely perceptible smile touched my lips. The reinforcements had finally arrived. Colonel Jonathan Hale stepped into the room, and the very atmosphere seemed to snap to attention. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of discipline, closing the door behind him with a quiet, decisive click. He didn't spare a single glance for my family. His focus was entirely on me. He walked to my bedside, his steel gray eyes filled with a concern that was both professional and deeply personal. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, his voice a low, commanding baritone. "I apologize for the delay." That one sentence did more to heal me than any medication could. He didn't call me Claire. He called me by my rank. He acknowledged my position, my service. In his eyes, I wasn't a disobedient daughter. I was a soldier, and I was his responsibility. My father, Arthur, finally found his voice, attempting to reassert his collapsed authority. "Who the hell are you?" he blustered. "This is a private family matter." Only then did Colonel Hale turn his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply fixed my father with an icy stare that could freeze fire. "I am Sergeant Monroe's legal counsel," he stated, each word a chip of ice. "And as of this moment, all communication with my client will go through me. Now, the three of you will leave." It wasn't a request. It was an order, the kind of order men followed without question. My mother, Helen, immediately resorted to her most trusted weapon, tears. She began to sob, a practiced theatrical performance. "But we're just worried about our baby girl." Colonel Hale cut her off without a shred of sympathy. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice sharp, "I have read the hospital's preliminary report. Your daughter's injuries are not consistent with a fall. Furthermore, your worry sounds more like an interrogation than bedside care." He then shifted his gaze to Rick, who was trying to make himself invisible near the wall. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "I have a feeling the Department of Justice will be very interested to learn about a civilian assaulting a uniformed member of the United States Armed Forces. That's a federal offense." The words "federal offense" hung in the air, heavy and menacing. For the first time in their lives, I saw genuine fear in my family's eyes. Not anger, not annoyance, but pure, unadulterated fear. They looked at each other, their alliance crumbling, their bravado gone. Without another word, they scrambled out of the room, a disgraced platoon in full retreat. Once they were gone, an incredible silence filled the space. Colonel Hale pulled a visitor's chair to my bedside, the scraping of its legs on the linoleum the only sound. He reached for the pitcher on my nightstand and poured me a glass of water, his large, steady hands a comforting presence. He handed it to me, then sat down, placing a sleek leather briefcase on the floor beside him. He also set a silver thermos on my bedside table. "Your grandmother, my Sarah, would have my hide if she knew you were stuck eating hospital food," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "It's her chicken noodle soup recipe. Soldiers need proper rations to recover." The simple, thoughtful gesture, a stark contrast to the fast food bags my family had left strewn about, caused a lump to form in my throat. This was family, not blood, but loyalty. The Marine Corps motto my grandfather and the colonel lived by echoed in my mind: Semper Fidelis, always faithful. He let me take a few sips of water before he spoke again, his voice softer now. "Your grandfather would never forgive me if I let this stand. I've been watching them for years, Claire, hoping they'd come around." He sighed, a deep, heavy sound of regret. I was wrong to wait this long. He leaned down and clicked open the latches on his briefcase. But I wasn't idle, he continued, looking me straight in the eye. We've been preparing for this day for a long time. You are not alone in this fight. You never were. His words were like a powerful dose of morphine, soothing the deep, invisible wounds my family had inflicted over the years. The feeling of utter isolation that had been my constant companion began to recede, replaced by a flicker of strength. He pulled a thin file from his briefcase and placed it on the tray table, over my lap. The label on the tab was printed in bold, black letters. Monroe, C. Preliminary Damage Report. "This is our mission brief, Sergeant," he said, his tone shifting back to that of a commanding officer. Phase 1. Stabilize the position and establish a security perimeter. That is now complete. He gave a firm nod. Phase 2. Intelligence gathering and presentation. Phase 3. Full-scale counter-offensive. He leaned forward, his expression serious, his gaze unwavering. I need to know. Are you ready for engagement? Because once we start this, there is no turning back. There are no half measures. For a moment, I just looked at him. The man who was my grandfather's best friend. The man who had become my only ally. The pain in my jaw was a dull fire, and my ribs ached with every breath. But for the first time in days, I felt something other than pain and humiliation. I felt the stirrings of a warrior. I met his gaze, and though my body was broken, my spirit was not. I pushed myself up slightly against the pillows. "Sir," I said, my voice raspy but clear and steady as a rifle shot. "I am ready." My declaration of readiness hung in the sterile air. Colonel Hale gave me a single, approving nod. He then reached down and unfastened the twin brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sound they made, two sharp, metallic clicks, was as definitive as chambering a round. This was no longer about feelings or family drama. This was about evidence. This was Phase 2. Inside the briefcase, there wasn't just one file, but a meticulously organized series of them, each tabbed with a neat, printed label. Joint account. James Monroe. Trust. Re-enlistment bonus. He lifted the first, thickest file and placed it gently in my hands. "This is the joint checking account your parents set up when you first enlisted," he explained, his voice calm and factual. "They told you it was to help manage your paychecks while you were deployed." I opened the folder. Inside were years of bank statements, printed in stark black and white. My hands trembled slightly as I scanned the pages. My Army salary, deposited like clockwork twice a month. And flowing out, a steady hemorrhage of my money. Thousands of dollars, month after month, transferred to other accounts. Thousands more spent on things I'd never seen, at places I'd never been. There were charges from Neiman Marcus, from exclusive golf clubs in the Cincinnati suburbs, from high-end steakhouses where a single meal cost more than my weekly groceries. I saw payments for car loans on vehicles I didn't own, and credit card bills filled with charges for electronics, clothes, and God knows what else. They had been living a second secret life funded by my service. As a soldier, I was trained in intelligence analysis. One of the first principles they teach you is to trust the data, not the story. For my entire life, the story had been that I was the one who owed them. The data in my hands told a different story. It was the story of a systematic, long-term financial drain. I was not a daughter. I was their primary source of funding. The next file was even more painful. James Monroe Trust. My grandfather, Captain Monroe, had left a significant trust fund for both me and Rick, with the strict legal condition that the money could only be used for higher education or a down payment on a first home. I had never touched a penny of mine, saving it for a future I was still building. But the documents inside told a story of methodical theft. My father, as the trustee, had exploited his position. Page after page showed withdrawal slips, signed in a crude forgery of my signature, draining the account. The reason listed was always the same: loan for family business investment. There was no family business. There had never been one. He had systematically stolen not just my money, but my grandfather's legacy. The honor of a great man, a war hero, had been soiled by the greed of his own son. The compass my grandfather had given me was meant to help me find my way, but his own son had lost his moral bearings completely. I placed the file down, my breathing shallow. The physical pain in my jaw was nothing compared to the searing agony of this betrayal. Colonel Hale said nothing. He simply reached into a side pocket of his briefcase and retrieved 2 photographs, placing them side by side on top of the files. The first was a printout from Rick's Facebook page. It was a picture of my father, my mother, and Rick, all grinning, tanned, and carefree on the deck of a yacht in Florida. Rick was holding a bottle of champagne, and the caption underneath read, "Livin' the good life. Blessed." The date stamp on the post was from last spring. My blood ran cold. I knew that date. I was in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. My unit was in the middle of Operation Mountain Viper, a grueling 3-week offensive in the punishing heat. We were living on MREs, sleeping in the dirt, and taking enemy fire almost daily. The second photograph was one I'd taken myself during that same week. I'd sent it home in an email with a 2-line message. Still safe? Love you all. It was a quick selfie, taken at a dusty forward operating base. My face was gaunt, covered in a film of sand and sweat, my eyes exhausted. But I was smiling, a tired, hopeful smile meant to reassure them. Colonel Hale pointed a finger at the glossy image of my family on the boat. "While you were fighting for your country," he said, his voice soft but laced with steel, "they were fighting over who got the best lounge chair on the yacht." That was the moment the tears should have come, a storm of grief, of rage, of sorrow. But they didn't. The emotional reservoirs were dry. Something else rose in their place, a cold, hard fury that settled deep in my bones. It was the anger of a soldier who realizes the enemy isn't on the other side of the wire. They're inside your own command tent. They're the ones you were sworn to protect. I looked up from the evidence, the paper a dead weight in my hands, and met the colonel's gaze. My voice when I spoke was steady, devoid of any tremor. It was the voice of a sergeant giving an after-action report. "They never thought I'd come home to check the books, did they?" I said, the realization settling like a shard of ice in my chest. Their entire plan was contingent on me getting killed. I took a deep, shuddering breath, not of sadness, but of pure, focused resolve. The grief was gone, replaced by clarity. The objective was clear. "All right, Colonel," I said, my voice hardening. "It's time to brief the enemy." 2 days later, Colonel Hale summoned them for what he termed a mandatory family meeting. He and I had spent the intervening time preparing the battlefield. My hospital room was no longer a recovery ward, it was a strategically prepared kill zone. When they walked in, they found me sitting up straight in bed. I had swapped the shapeless hospital gown for a clean gray Army PT shirt, the bold black letters across my chest, a quiet declaration of identity. My face was still bruised, but my expression was not that of a victim. It was the calm, controlled mask of a commander about to brief her troops. And we had an observer. In the far corner of the room, seated in a simple chair, was a nondescript man in civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt. He was quietly taking notes in a small pad. My family filed in, their confidence slightly restored. They likely assumed they could manipulate their way out of this with a well-practiced performance of guilt and love. My father, Arthur, scowled at the man in the corner. "Who's he?" Colonel Hale didn't rise. "This is Mr. Miller," he said casually. "He's just here to observe." He gestured to the chairs. "Please, have a seat. Sergeant Monroe has a few points she'd like to clarify regarding the family's financial report." The calm corporate language seemed to throw my father off balance, but he quickly fell back on his default setting. Rage. "I'm not clarifying a damn thing," he boomed, attempting to seize control. "This is my house, my money. Everything you have, you owe to me." Colonel Hale didn't argue. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the bedside table toward my father. His movements were deliberate, economical. "This is a copy of the title deed to your house, Mr. Monroe. And this is a bank statement showing that you used Sergeant Monroe's combat pay to service a second mortgage on that house, a mortgage taken out to cover your son's gambling debts. He paused, letting the words sink in. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that is called embezzlement, a felony. My father stared at the paper, his face turning a familiar shade of purple. My mother, seeing the first line of defense crumble, switched to her preferred tactic. She burst into tears. "Claire, how could you do this to your own family?" she wailed, her voice thick with manufactured pain. For the first time, I spoke. I looked directly at her, not with anger, but with a cold, piercing clarity. "The correct question, Helen, is how could you do this to me?" I said, using her first name. "You stood and watched while they stole my future, and then you stood and watched while he attacked me. Your silence was your consent. It always has been." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Her sobs sputtered out, replaced by a shocked, open-mouthed silence. Now it was Rick's turn. Cornered and desperate, he fell back on the only weapon he had left: threats. "You think you're going to win this?" he snarled, stepping toward the bed. "I'll ruin you. I'll call your commanding officer. I'll tell them you're a drunk, that you're unstable. I will destroy your career." Before he could take another step, Colonel Hale placed a second file on the table with a soft thud. He flipped it open. "Your file, Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice flat. 3 arrests for public disorder, 2 terminations for petty theft from previous employers, and over $50,000 in credit card debt. He then tapped a finger on my pristine service record lying next to it. "And Sergeant Monroe's file. Decorated soldier, exemplary reviews, top-level security clearance. Now, tell me again, who do you think the Army is going to believe? A combat veteran or a deadbeat with a rap sheet?" Rick's face crumpled. His entire persona, built on a foundation of unearned arrogance, disintegrated before my eyes. He looked like a lost little boy. They were broken, disarmed, and confused. The battle was won, but Colonel Hale had one final decisive strike to deliver. "And lastly," he said, pulling out his smartphone, "there's just this one little thing." He tapped the screen. A voice filled the silent room. A voice I knew better than my own. It was my father, Arthur, captured from a phone call with Rick a few days prior. The recording was crystal clear. "Let her think she's a hero. She's still our ATM. As long as she keeps sending that check home, she can play general all she wants." The phone call ended. A dead, suffocating silence descended on the room. It was heavier than any shout, more damning than any accusation. The air itself felt thick with the filth of their lies. From the corner of the room, Mr. Miller, the quiet observer from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, slowly looked up from his notepad. He didn't say a word. He just lifted his gaze and locked eyes with my father. And in that moment, the final wall of their deceit came crashing down. If you believe that truth is the most powerful weapon against abuse, please support this story by hitting the like button. And in the comments, just type one word: justice. Let them know we're all watching. After my father's recorded voice, so confident, so casually cruel, faded into nothing, a profound silence consumed the room. It was absolute, a vacuum where sound used to be. The only things I could hear were the low, indifferent hum of the air conditioner cycling on and the quiet, methodical scratching of Mr. Miller's pen on his notepad. It was the sound of history being officially recorded, the sound of a dynasty crumbling under its own weight. I just watched them. In that moment, I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of vindication. But there was nothing. No joy, no satisfaction. Only a vast, weary emptiness. The kind a soldier feels after a long and brutal campaign when the adrenaline finally drains away, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of survival. I was no longer a combatant. I was an assessor, calmly cataloging the damage on the battlefield. Arthur Monroe, the self-appointed 4-star general of our family, the man whose roar could make the walls tremble, simply slumped into a chair. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, waxy pallor like old parchment. All the bluster, the rage, the tyrannical control, it all evaporated, leaving a defeated, bewildered old man in its place. He stared at his hands, turning them over and over as if he'd never seen them before. His command was broken, his authority annihilated. Helen began to weep again, But this time, the performance was gone. The sobs were real, ugly, choking, desperate gasps for a sympathy that no one in the room was willing to give. She rocked back and forth, her face buried in her hands, her carefully constructed world shattered by a 30-second audio clip. And Rick, my brother, the enforcer, the golden child, simply stared at the floor. His eyes were fixed on a single scuff mark on the linoleum, as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was a statue of shame, motionless. They had been utterly and completely disarmed, stripped of their weapons, their lies, their carefully constructed reality. They were left exposed and raw by the ugly, undeniable truth of who they were. Colonel Hale, ever the professional, allowed the silence to do its work for a long, heavy moment before he moved. He broke the spell, his voice calm and professional, devoid of any gloating. He turned his attention to the CID agent. "Mr. Miller, do you have everything you need?" The investigator closed his notepad with a soft, definitive snap. He stood, a quiet man who now seemed to hold all the power in the room, and tucked the pad into his jacket pocket. "I believe so, Colonel. Thank you for your cooperation." He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over my family before landing on me with a flicker of what might have been respect. "We'll be in touch, Sergeant." The finality in his voice, the official presence of federal law enforcement preparing to leave, finally broke through their shock and into sheer, unadulterated panic. My father's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "Claire, honey," he stammered, his voice a pathetic, wheezing whisper I had never heard before. We can work this out. We can fix this. In the family." The plea was absurd, a dying king trying to issue orders from a dungeon. I met his desperate gaze, and the strangest thing happened. I felt nothing. No spark of pity, no lingering echo of affection. The well was dry. "No," I said, my voice quiet but as firm as the hospital's concrete foundation. "We can't, because we are not a family anymore. You made the rules yourself, Arthur. This is your chain of command. And in this chain of command, a mutiny has just occurred." Suddenly, my mother was on her knees by my bedside, her hands clawing at my thin hospital blanket like a drowning woman. This was her final, most potent weapon. "After everything I've sacrificed for you, Claire," she cried, her voice rising with practiced hysteria. "How can you do this after all my sacrifices?" I looked down at her, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon identifying a disease. "Sacrifice?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was level, almost conversational. "You sacrificed me to him. You sacrificed my safety for your own quiet life. You sacrificed my future for your illusion of a peaceful home." I leaned forward just slightly, my words a quiet indictment. "That isn't sacrifice, Helen. That's cowardice." She recoiled as if I had physically struck her. In a last, desperate act, she tried to grab my hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry." Her apology was a hollow, meaningless sound in the quiet room. It wasn't for me, it was for herself, a frantic plea for an absolution she hadn't earned. I gently but firmly pulled my hand away from her grasp. "An apology doesn't fix a broken jaw, Mother," I said softly, the words costing me the last of my energy. "It doesn't return the money I earned risking my life in a war zone. Your apology is about making you feel better, not about making things right." I took a breath, the air stinging my bruised ribs. "And I will not grant you that peace." That was it. That was the moment the final toxic tether between us snapped for good, its frayed ends falling away into dust. Colonel Hale stood, a silent signal that the meeting was over. His presence filled the room, a bulwark of order against their emotional chaos. "Legal notices will be delivered to your residence tomorrow," he announced to the room at large, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Relevant accounts will be frozen pending investigation, and a restraining order will be filed to protect Sergeant Monroe from any further contact." They looked like ghosts as they shuffled toward the door, their faces empty, their movements slow and unsteady, as if they were wading through deep water. The Monroe dynasty, with its iron-fisted ruler and silent queen, had fallen in a small hospital room in Maryland. As they reached the threshold, a single unit of defeated spirits, I spoke one last time. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. From this moment on, you are nothing more to me than names on a legal document. My tour of duty with this family is over. I looked each of them in the eye, one by one. Dismissed. The word, a clean military command, echoed in the quiet room long after they were gone. It wasn't a cry of anger. It wasn't a shout of victory. It was the closing of a file, the end of a war. A few days after my final briefing, the hospital discharged me. My jaw was still wired shut. My ribs still ached with a fiery protest at every deep breath. But the doctors declared me stable enough to leave. Colonel Hale was there, waiting for me with his car. He had already arranged everything. This wasn't a return home, it was a strategic withdrawal from the field of battle. Instead of heading north towards Cincinnati, he drove south on Route 33, into the heart of the Appalachian foothills. The landscape shifted from flat Ohio farmland to the dense rolling forests of Hocking Hills. We drove for over an hour, winding down narrow country roads flanked by towering pines and ancient rock formations. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The quiet hum of the engine and the blur of green outside the window were a soothing balm. Finally, he turned down a long gravel driveway that ended at a small, secluded log cabin. It was nestled in a grove of hemlock trees, overlooking a serene, glass-still lake. As I stepped out of the car, the silence was the first thing I noticed. It was a profound, living quiet, punctuated only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a bird. It was then I realized that for the last 32 years, I'd been holding my breath. I took a deep, shuddering lungful of the cool, clean air, rich with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt like the first true breath of my life. "No one knows you're here except for me and my wife," Jonathan said, retrieving my bag from the trunk. "Consider this your secure rear base of operations, Sergeant. Rest and refit. That's your only mission for now." For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt safe. Truly safe. The first few days were lost in a fog of exhaustion. The war was over, and the adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation had vanished, leaving a crushing weariness in its wake. I slept. I slept for 16 hours at a time, my body and spirit desperately trying to repair the damage of a lifetime of conflict. Slowly, consciousness returned. Life began to organize itself into small, deliberate rituals of healing. Each morning, I would wake to the sight of mist rising off the lake. I would make a simple cup of coffee and sit on the porch, watching the sun burn through the fog. My jaw was still wired, so my diet consisted of soup from the colonel's thermos and protein shakes. Even that simple act of nourishing myself on my own terms felt like a victory. I started walking. At first, it was just a slow, painful shuffle to the edge of the water. Then, a little further each day, following the narrow path that ringed the lake. I focused on the feeling of the solid ground beneath my feet, the rhythm of my own breathing. I was relearning how to simply exist in a space without threat. One of my old instructors had a saying: "After every battle, the most important tasks are to clean your weapon, tend to your wounds, and fortify your lines." That's what I was doing. I read books, I listened to music. I cooked simple meals for myself once the wires came off. These weren't grand gestures of recovery, they were small acts of reconstruction, the laying of a new foundation, brick by painstaking brick. I was clearing my inner battlefield. The war, of course, was still being fought on a different front. The legal proceedings churned on in the distance, a storm system I could observe from my secure position. Colonel Hale kept me updated with concise, factual emails. The subject lines were always the same: SITREP, situation report. The criminal investigation was proceeding. Civil suits had been filed. Their assets were frozen. My old world tried to breach my new defenses. Emails and voicemails started trickling in from distant aunts and cousins, forwarded by a well-meaning friend who didn't know the full story. They were all variations on the same theme: thinly veiled accusations wrapped in concern. "How could you do this to your parents? Family is everything. You need to find it in your heart to forgive. Following the Colonel's advice, I didn't reply. I created a new email filter, a digital firewall that blocked any message containing their names. It was another small act of defiance. I was fortifying my perimeter. One evening, about a month into my stay, I was sitting on the porch as the sun began its slow descent, painting the lake in hues of orange and deep purple. I opened the briefcase Colonel Hale had left for me and took out the official documents, the promotion orders to Sergeant First Class, and the notification of the bonus award. I stared at the number, $20 million. Before, that number had been a symbol of the approval I had so desperately craved from my family. It was a trophy I had intended to lay at their feet, hoping it would finally be enough. Now, it had an entirely different meaning. It was no longer a prize to be displayed. It was a resource. It was ammunition. It was the capital I needed to fund a new life, to build something of my own. It was the tool I would use to construct a legacy, not of their lies and greed, but of my own honor and resilience. A plan, quiet and uncertain at first, began to form in my mind. It was a mission concept, the first draft of a new set of orders written by me, for me. 6 months passed, 6 months of quiet healing by the lake in Hocking Hills, of physical therapy rebuilding the strength in my body, and of silence rebuilding the strength in my soul. On a crisp autumn afternoon, my phone rang. It was the Colonel. I didn't attend the final court proceedings in Cincinnati. I didn't need to. That battlefield was his to command. "Mission accomplished, Sergeant," Jonathan said, his voice laced with a grim satisfaction that only a fellow warrior could truly understand. The consequences, fueled by the mountain of irrefutable evidence and the severity of assaulting a federal officer, were absolute. The Monroe family's fortress was not just breached, it was leveled to the ground. My father, Arthur, was sentenced to federal prison for fraud, embezzlement of a trust, and conspiracy. Rick received his own prison sentence for the assault and related fraud charges. My mother, Helen, in a last-minute deal to testify against them, received 5 years of probation, community service, and was ordered to pay a significant portion of the restitution. The house in Cincinnati, the citadel of my childhood misery, was seized and liquidated as part of the civil settlement awarded to me. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a feeling. It was a series of cold, hard, legal decisions. A week later, a package arrived from Colonel Hale. It contained a list from my parents' lawyer detailing personal effects from the house. Under the terms of the settlement, I was entitled to claim any items of sentimental value before the rest was auctioned off. I scanned the long itemized list of furniture, electronics, and household goods, so many of which had been purchased with my own stolen money. I took out a pen and made my selection. My request was short. I asked for only 3 things: Captain James Monroe's dress uniform and his military-issue compass, and a small dusty shoebox from under the bed in my old room. Everything else, the photos on the walls, the lazy boy recliner, the pearl necklace they'd bought with my re-enlistment bonus, I left it all to the court. It was a symbolic act of severance. I was keeping only the items that represented my true lineage of honor and my own unseen accomplishments. I was cutting away everything that belonged to the lie. The package also contained a letter, forwarded from their attorney. It was a handwritten, tear-stained plea from my mother, full of rambling justifications and accusations. She blamed my father's temper, Rick's bad luck, and my own stubbornness. It ended with a desperate appeal for me to withdraw the criminal charges, for the sake of the blood we share. Years ago, a letter like that would have torn me apart, filled me with a toxic cocktail of guilt and rage. But as I sat on the porch overlooking the calm, quiet lake, I felt nothing. A deep, profound emptiness where the anger used to be. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. I couldn't change them. They were who they were. But I could change how I allowed them to affect me. I didn't rip up the letter. Instead, I opened my journal. I began to write a response, not for her, but for me. It was a final after-action report, an entry to close this chapter of my life for good. To the people who were once my family, I wrote, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I forgive you not to absolve you of your crimes, but to absolve myself of the burden of carrying your hatred. Forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is accepting that I cannot change the past, but I have absolute authority over my future, a future that will not have you in it. I release you. I release myself from the anger, from the pain, and from the hope that you would ever be the family I needed. I hope you find whatever redemption you are capable of. But that is your path to walk. Alone. I closed the journal. The act felt more final, more liberating than any court verdict. I was finally, truly, free. The following weekend, the colonel drove down to the cabin. He brought with him a large box containing the 3 items I had requested. I lifted the lid and carefully unwrapped my grandfather's uniform, the wool still smelling faintly of cedar. I picked up the small shoebox and saw the gold medal inside, still gleaming dully in the afternoon light. And then I held the compass. It felt heavy and solid in my palm, the needle quivering slightly before settling, as it always did, pointing steadfastly north. We sat on the porch for a long time, just watching the water. Finally, he asked the question that had been hanging in the air. So, what now, Claire? I looked out at the shimmering surface of the lake, the future feeling as wide and open as the water before me. I thought of the $20 million bonus, the money that had been the catalyst for so much destruction. That money, it's not really mine anymore, Colonel, I said. The plan that had been forming in my mind now solidifying into a clear objective. It belongs to people like me. People with the talent and the drive, but without the opportunity or the support. I turned to him, my eyes filled with a new, unwavering purpose. My father tried to bury my grandfather's legacy in a mountain of greed and lies. I'm not going to let that happen. I held up the compass, its needle pointing north. I'm going to use it to build something that lasts, something that honors him. I met his gaze, the warrior in me replaced by a builder. I have a new mission plan, Colonel. 2 years later. The setting is no longer a sterile hospital room or a tense courtroom. It's a sun-drenched autumn afternoon on the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. The air is crisp, and golden leaves drift down from the towering oak and maple trees, blanketing the manicured lawns that surround the university's iconic limestone buildings. After the legal battles were won, I finished my military service, receiving an honorable discharge with my full rank and honors intact. The Army had my back. With a small portion of the settlement and bonus, I enrolled in a master's program at MIT focusing on artificial intelligence and machine learning, the very field I had poured my soul into while in uniform. But that was only part of my new mission. The bulk of the money, the $20 million that had nearly cost me my life, became the seed capital for something new. I founded a nonprofit organization called the North Star Foundation. Its mission is simple: to provide full-ride scholarships and mentorship programs for veterans, especially women who want to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We fund the education my father stole from my grandfather's trust, but on a much grander scale. Today is the Foundation's first ever scholarship award ceremony. It's a small, intimate gathering in a beautiful old lecture hall on campus. From my position at the podium, I can see Colonel Jonathan Hale sitting in the front row. He's on my foundation's board of advisors now, a proud, steadfast presence in a dark, gray suit. He catches my eye and gives me a slow, deliberate wink. Sitting next to him are 5 other people who are just as important. They are the core members of my old unit from Afghanistan. My tech sergeant, my comms specialist, my 2 best coders, my real family, my chosen family. They flew in from all over the country, from Texas, from California, from Washington State, just to be here for this. There were no grand speeches or emotional reunions, just solid handshakes, knowing looks, and the easy camaraderie that is forged only in shared hardship. Their quiet presence in the front row is the most powerful testament to loyalty and brotherhood I have ever known. a living embodiment of the values my blood relatives never understood. I look out at the small audience, and my gaze settles on a young woman sitting beside the colonel. Her name is Sergeant Eva Rostova, a recently discharged Marine who worked in cyber intelligence. She's brilliant, driven, and the inaugural recipient of the Captain James Monroe North Star Scholarship. She's here to study robotics. I grip the sides of the podium, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips, and I begin to speak. My voice is steady, confident, no longer the raspy whisper of a victim, but the clear, resonant tone of a leader. They say that family is supposed to be our compass, I begin, my voice filling the quiet hall. The ones who are meant to guide us, to help us find our way in the world. But sometimes that compass is broken. Sometimes it's been damaged by greed or jealousy or fear. Sometimes it only points in one direction, backward into the darkness of the past. I look directly at Eva, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and nervousness that I know so well. When that happens, I continue, you have a choice. You can let that broken compass lead you in circles for the rest of your life, or you can learn to look up at the stars. You can learn to find your own true north. I step away from the podium and walk over to her, holding a large ceremonial check. As I hand it to her, our hands touch for a brief moment. In that instant, I'm not just giving her money for tuition. I'm giving her a chance. I'm giving her the validation I never had. I'm passing on a legacy, not of pain, but of purpose. I'm giving her a map to a future that she will build for herself. Later, after the ceremony is over and the last of the guests have departed, I walk alone across the campus. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows on the grass, the light warm and golden on my face. I trace the faint, silvery line of the scar on my jawline. It's barely visible now, a pale ghost of the war I survived. It no longer hurts to touch. My journey is far from over. But as I walk toward the setting sun, a final thought settles in my mind. A message to the world and a promise to myself. They tried to bury me. They threw the weight of their betrayal, their greed, and their lies on top of me, hoping I would suffocate in the dark. They didn't know they were burying a seed. And from the deepest, darkest soil, I learned how to grow, how to fight my way upward, inch by painful inch, until I finally broke through into the light. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor. And my real mission has only just begun. My mission has just begun, and it's a mission I don't want to walk alone. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated by the people who were supposed to love them most. If you believe in the power of rewriting your own story, I invite you to subscribe and join this community. Hit the like button if you stand for turning pain into purpose, and in the comments below, share just one word that defines the future you are building for yourself. Thank you for listening.